Standing Order 43, the time for members' statements has concluded. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. This Prime Minister has presided over the lowest wages growth on record. So why is this inept Prime Minister making life harder for working Australians by making them pay $300 more income tax every year and at the same time handing away $65 billion of taxpayer money to big corporations?
The Prime Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the honourable member opposite knows full well that we are seeking to pay for the NDIS. The NDIS, which the Labor Party did not fund. The NDIS, which needs the guaranteed financial security, Labor would not provide it, and we are seeking to do so in precisely the same way that the Labor government did in part when they were in power. But, Mr Speaker, the honourable member asked me about big corporations and the inequality. Well, Mr Speaker, most people, when they go snorkelling on the Barrier Reef, pay for it themselves, but not the Leader of the Opposition. Oh no. And we heard the indignation. We heard the indignation about Point Piper, the suburb I lived in. He's down on those millionaires in Point Piper, but he wasn't above taking thousands of dollars from the Australian Conservation Foundation, Jeff Cousins' foundation, Jeff Cousins there, who has reported on the trip that they funded, the Leader of the Opposition, and which was only disclosed after Mr Cousins came out with his report. Only disclosed. It was amazing. Now, what was the name of that other donor to the Leader of the Opposition? Unibuild? Was it a donor that only came out after the event? Well, there's a bit of a pattern there. But,
the
Mr.
Prime
Speaker,
Minister
course,
will resume his seat. The members on my right, the Minister for Urban Infrastructure will cease interjecting. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. Just asking the Prime Minister to be directly relevant to the question he was asked, not the answer he prepared.
Just before I call the Prime Minister, whilst the question did mention large companies, the Prime Minister is entitled to compare and contrast, but I do agree that he's now drifting off the subject matter of the question.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And let me return to the subject of jobs, which the honourable member also raised. And what about the jobs of coal miners? What about the jobs of members of the CFMEU? Now, we remember on the 6th of October last year, not so long ago, Tony Marr said at the rally where the member for Gorton and the Leader of the Opposition were spewing in the words of the Leader of the Opposition.
Could the Prime Minister resume his seat for a second? Whilst I'm appreciative that the Prime Minister's got off the previous topic, he's now on to another topic well, I don't think the question related to jobs. Wages growth, certainly, but I think there's wages growth, large companies and tax increases.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, wages growth is driven by the laws of supply and demand. And if there is no demand for the jobs of coal miners, their wages won't go up. And there's no better way to stop the growth in coal miners' wages than to do precisely what the Leader of the Opposition has done, which is to tell the miners he backs them when he's there on the picket line, but then secretly, with a donation from a Point Piper millionaire, they're dreadful people, goes up to the Barrier Reef and gives a commitment
to revoke the licence. The member for Dawson will cease interjecting. The member for SWAN has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on how the government is creating jobs and opportunities for hard-working Australians by growing the economy? Is the Prime Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
Great question. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his question. Mr Speaker, 403,000 jobs last year, largest number in our history. 16 consecutive months of jobs growth, the longest run of jobs growth ever recorded. But, Mr Speaker, we want to create more jobs and more better paid jobs, and we want to get more Australians into work, especially those that are unemployed. And those of us on this side of the House know that the best form of welfare is a job. And the members opposite may disagree, but we believe every Australian should have the opportunity to experience the dignity and stability of a job. And we believe every Australian should have that opportunity, and that's why our growth plan, our economic plan, is pro-growth, pro-investment and pro-jobs. And it's working. Mr Speaker, not only have we had record jobs growth, there are now fewer Australians on welfare than at any time in the last 20 years. And that's because of initiatives like our PATH program for young people, lower business taxes, our wage subsidy scheme, which is getting the long-term unemployed back into work. Now, this morning I visited Total Insulation, a local business here in Canberra, where I met Shannon Fairbanks, the 100,000th Australian to be employed with the help of our wage subsidy scheme. Shannon told us he'd been unemployed for 3 years, but now, thanks to this program, this incentive and the commitment of his employer, he's building the skills and confidence and experience that set him up for success. But what's Labor's plan? What's Labor's plan for jobs? They have none. All they want to deliver is higher taxes and more regulation. They want to raise taxes by more than $150 billion. That's the equivalent of $6,000 for every Australian. And yet at the same time, he says he cares about jobs and the economy. Just like he told the workers at Oakey, they had no better friend than him, and he'd always do the right thing by them. There was Bill. Spare was he was the leader of the opposition.
The Prime Minister will refer to members by their correct titles.
Corrected. There, that's your new word. There was a very talking about his GQ article. You know, it's quite dating. He was spewing at Oakey North, and he's using the F word in the GQ interview. Yes. And then he complains, Mr Speaker, that he doesn't think that Lucy and I will invite him for dinner. Well, Mr Speaker, as long as he promises not to do that again, we wouldn't have any objection.
The member for Ballarat has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. APRA has revealed that private health insurers received $3.2 billion more in premiums than Australians received in health benefits last year. Why is this inept Prime Minister giving a $65 billion handout to big business, including big insurers, instead of trying to help ordinary Australians with the cost of private health insurance?
Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for a question because it gives me the opportunity to remind her of the very sound observations made by her leader only a few years ago, that reducing business tax results in more investment, more productivity and more jobs. And the reality is he was right then, but he's wrong now. And one thing we know is that he says whatever suits his purpose at the time. And just like he told the workers at Oakey North, he was pro-coal, and he tells Jeff Cousins he is going to withdraw the licence for the Adani mine and put those workers out of a job.
Prime Minister will resume his seat. The member for Ballarat on a point of order.
On direct relevance, the question was about why you are backing 3065.
The member for Ballarat will resume her seat. got bad history on points of order. The Prime Minister will
Invite the Minister for Health to discuss health insurance, also raised in the question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker and Prime Minister. Labor hates private health insurance, and it gets worse. Now, here's the context. Let me quote from the Leader of the Opposition just a couple of weeks ago. The big health insurers are making profits of 25%, he says. And here is what APRA said.
Chifley.
Here is the very body that has just been quoted by the hapless Shadow Health Minister. APRA said not 25%, not 20%, not 15%, not 10%, but APRA said in their most recent report 5.5% net margins. 5.5%. He didn't just inflate it once or twice, 3 or 4 times, but nearly 5 times, and he's caught out with a shameless fabrication. But better still, what did APRA also say? The very body named by the hapless Shadow Health Minister. APRA said, following Labor's recent comments about private health, it's very much in the community's interest that the current reform process continues, referring to what this government has done in delivering the lowest change in private health insurance in 17 years, lower than every single year under Labor. And then devastatingly for the ALP, APRA goes on to say, APRA does not consider industry profits or capital levels to be the primary drivers of rising premiums. What a bunch of frauds on the other side. Worse still, though, for all of their hate of private health, for all of their sort of fraudulent position, they have a proposal to slash the rebate and drive up private health insurance by 16%. Drive up private health insurance costs by 16%. At the end of the day, they're private health frauds, they're Medi frauds, and the member for Sydney said it absolutely best last time. Everything I did by targeting private health insurance.
The member for Goldstein.
My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House on how the budget is fully funding the government's enterprise tax plan, as well as supporting critical infrastructure that will help our economy grow? Is the Treasurer aware of any alternate approaches?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for Goldstein for his question. Well, last night, Mr. Speaker, we saw a bit more of the inspiration that Labor is seeking and finding into how they're driving their economic policies. Last night, the member for Scullin got up in the adjournment debate, and he got up and he was revelling in the almond lattes left new custodian status of economic policy in the Labor Party. He was boasting how Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders were now what was inspiring the Labor Party, and that's why voters in Batman should be voting for the Labor Party. The Corbyn-Sanders ticket there, it's no longer Hawke and Keating, it's Corbyn and Sanders which is driving economic policy in the Labor Party. Now, Mr. Speaker, we know that the Shadow Treasurer's excuse that he uses around the place to hide his backflip, his contradiction, he's turning his back on his previous position on company taxes is he says they're unfunded. Now, the Parliamentary Budget Office set this straight when they pulled the rug from the Shadow Treasurer's argument where they stated the fact that the budget baseline is improving is reflected in the most recent MAYO, and that includes the company tax cuts. Now, for the benefit of the Deputy Leader opposite, that means it's fully funded. Now, Mr. Speaker, today the Treasury Secretary equally pointed out very clearly when he said of the tax cuts, we have put them in, that is the tax cuts, obviously in the forward estimates, and we've also put them into our estimates for the longer term. He says they're fully funded from the Treasury Secretary. Now, we know that responsible budgeting requires you to fully fund the things that you're doing, and that's what we've done in our budget. But what you also have to do, because the Shadow Treasurer has raised this issue of underfunded commitments, the PBO pointed something else out very importantly this week. Senator Smith asked the PBO whether the Labor Party had booked the savings from the full reversal of the company tax cut, yet had still blown out the budget by $16 billion at the last election. The PBO said that is correct. Now, what that means, Mr Speaker, is this. As you would know, just to pay for the spending promises they made at the last election, they have to fully reverse all of the company tax cuts. But it also means this. All the money of reversing the tax cuts that they propose is fully spent. So when they were up in Townsville last week, when they were up in Townsville, when they were up in North Queensland, even in Melbourne talking about tram extensions, and they were claiming some $300 million in new expenditure and claiming it was funded from reversing the company tax cut. That is a lie, Mr Speaker. Every time you hear Labor say they are funding new expenditure from reversing the company tax cuts, it is a lie.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. This Prime Minister has presided over the lowest wages growth on record. So why is this inept Prime Minister making things even worse by supporting cuts to penalty rates for nearly 700,000 Australian workers, whilst at the same time giving big business a $65 billion taxpayer handout?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, reducing business tax results in more investment, more productivity, more employment and better paid jobs. And that has been the consistent experience right around the world. The Leader of the Opposition
the member for Morton.
They're experiencing that now in the United States. The member for McMahon wrote a book about it. It is hardly rocket science. It has been the universal experience, and that is why governments in the past of both the Labor persuasion and the coalition persuasions have reduced business taxes, and we've seen that result. That is how you drive jobs and jobs growth. But, Mr Speaker, you have to be consistent about your policies. You have to be, as the Leader of the Opposition said in his GQ article, where he was asked whether he was Clinton-esque, and he didn't demur to that, of course. But, Mr Speaker, what we've seen is a complete backflip by the Leader of the Opposition. He stood with the workers at Oakey North and he told them, with the member for O'Connor, that he supported them. Tony Marr stood up and said, Bill Shorten is very pro-coal mining. And I can tell you that from personal experience. Tony Marr said that to those workers on the picket line standing next to the Leader of the Opposition. And then, Mr Speaker, after receiving thousands of dollars of generous hospitality from the Australian Conservation Foundation, courtesy of Jeff Cousins, a reef tour with Wavelength Reef Cruises, a charter flight from Cairns to Carmichael River and Doongambulla Springs, ending in Townsville, accommodation, it's a long list. All of that was provided, but it was done in secret because the Leader of the Opposition said to Jeff Cousins, no media, didn't want anyone to know.
Prime Minister will resume his seat. Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. The question goes to penalty rates. The answer doesn't. Can he please be directly relevant?
The Prime Minister has addressed wages and the other aspects of the question. He's now moving away from the substance of the question. Has the Prime Minister concluded his answer? Yes, just before I call the member for Indi, I just like to inform the House we have present in the gallery this afternoon Mr Tim Smith, the State Member for Kew in the Victorian Parliament. On behalf of the House, a very warm welcome to you, and I call the member for Mayo.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Agriculture and Water Resources. Thanks to Senator Patrick's order for production of documents, we now know that the federal government paid more than twice the market price for water buybacks in the Warrego catchment, paying $1,600 a megalitre versus payment of around $720 a megalitre for similar licences in the same region. Can the minister explain why more than twice the commercial rate was paid and why the independent valuations were redacted? And is the minister aware of any relationships or friendships all conflicts of interest between the beneficiaries of the water buybacks in the Warrego catchment and the former or current Minister for Water and Resources.
The Minister for Agriculture has the call.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the honourable member for her question, because the Warrego in fact lies in my electorate, the Warrego River, and I do know the proponents, as you would in a small community of Cunnamulla of only 800 people. It is quite obvious about that. Let me say around the pricing that was put in place, it is always at arm's length for the government. In fact, I was not even the minister when those negotiations took place. So if you're here to try and character assassinate me in some cheap attempt to score some political points in South Australia where you destroyed the Bateson plan along with the Labor Party, this was their plan, this was their review. They are destroying the livelihoods of 2 million Australians up and down the Basin.
Member for Isaacs has been warned.
Because they are worried about Jay Weatherall and Nick Xenophon getting a vote. That's what it comes down to, pure politics. Pure politics by the Australian Labor Party, and now Nick Xenophon and the next team. Nothing more than a cold, callous political machine both of you have turned into. You are destroying the livelihoods of those people, and you should hang your heads in shame.
Has the minister's concluded his answer? The member for Flynn.
Yeah.
The member for Flynn has the call.
My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister, the Minister of Infrastructure and Transport. Will the Deputy Prime Minister update the House on how the Coalition Government is delivering job-creating infrastructure and resource projects across Queensland? Is he aware of any alternative approaches which pose a risk to those jobs of hard-working Queenslanders?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the very, very popular member for Flynn. He's not only popular in his own electorate, but he's obviously very popular in here too, as he should be, as he should be. He's a hard worker, he's a fighter. He's a fighter in his electorate for local jobs, for infrastructure, for the resources sector and for his people and for regional Australia. He knows, we know. Infrastructure investment and private sector investment stimulates local economies and creates local jobs. And our government is delivering. It's cutting taxes, the lowest company tax rate since 1940. It's cutting red tape, $5.8 billion of red tape slashed each and every year under the Liberal and Nationals. Building local infrastructure. That's what we're delivering. As well, 403,000 jobs last year equates to 1,100 jobs a day, many of them full-time employees. Now, another great example, of job creation is in the Adani Carmichael project. 2,500 direct jobs and 8,300 indirect jobs during construction. 3,900 direct jobs and 11,800 jobs in operation, as well as 2,000 jobs supporting fly-in, fly-out workers in Rockhampton, in the member for Capricornia's electorate, and Townsville in the great member for Dawson's electorate, as well as in the seat of Herbert. What's the member for Herbert think about this? What's she doing? Is she supporting these local jobs when youth unemployment in Townsville is running above 20%? Is she fighting for these local jobs? Is the Leader of the Opposition, the member for Maribyrnong, is he fighting for these local jobs? No way. No way, not this bloke. Not this bloke. There's only one job he's fighting for, and that's his own. He's gone from the faceless man to the two-faced man. He and his mates are still wielding their knives, though, aren't they? Albeit butter knives. And what have the workers got to say about him? Chiquita Mushrooms. One employee said, he sold us out. He sold us out. That's what one worker said. It's a similar story for the workers at Clean Event. The workers of Queensland can't trust him. The workers of Batman can't trust him. And the people in Queensland can't trust him. So if they can't trust him, and nor can the union members who he purports to represent, Mr Speaker, how can the people of Australia trust the member for Maribyrnong? Lou Christie once sang a song, made famous by Old 55, called Two Faces Have I, and this applies to the Leader of Opposition opposite. The writing is on the wall. The writing is on the wall, but it's also a mural. It's also a mural, Mr Speaker, on the corner of High and Bell Streets in Melbourne, Mr Speaker, in the electorate of Batman, Mr Speaker. It is. There it is, Mr Speaker.
The Deputy Prime Minister knows the rules on props. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Pensioners are struggling to pay their power bills because energy prices are at record highs under this Conservative government. Why is this inept Prime Minister cutting the energy supplement of $365 a year for single pensioners to pay for his $65 billion big business tax cut?
The Minister for the Environment and Energy.
Well, the changes to the energy supplement are still in Labor's costings, Mr Speaker. They're still in Labor's costings. Now, I'm glad we got a Dorothy Dixer on energy, Mr Speaker, because it's been more than 130 days since the member for Port Adelaide and Labor have asked a question on energy. And do you think that is because when Labor was last in office, energy prices doubled, Mr Speaker? Energy prices doubled. And we got the carbon tax, and we got the Citizens' Assembly, and we got the cash for clunkers, Mr Speaker. And we saw network prices skyrocket, Mr Speaker, as the gold plating took place. And now the Leader of the Opposition, he's asked for a national solution, and he asked us to listen to the experts, and he said he wanted a bipartisan approach. So when the Energy Security Board came forward with the National Energy Guarantee, which independent modelling shows will leave the average Australian household $300 a year better off than they would be under the Labor Party, he turns his back. He turns his back. And today on the front page of the Australian Financial Review, we see Andrew Liveris. Andrew Liveris, a proud Australian and the head of Dow Chemical, and somebody who knows a thing or two about creating jobs because he employs nearly 100,000 people, and he says that the states need to get behind the National Energy Guarantee and that the Labor Party needs to get behind the National Energy Guarantee as a means of creating jobs and investment certainty. And the other thing that he says, the other thing that Andrew Liveris says is it's time to stop those blanket bans and moratoriums on gas development that you see across Labor states. In the state of Victoria, Daniel Andrews is not only locking up unconventional gas, he's also locking up onshore conventional gas, Mr Speaker. Higher prices, Mr Speaker. There are 40 years' worth of supply in Victoria that are being locked up by Labor government, Mr Speaker. It all goes to energy prices.
The Minister for Energy will just take a seat for a second. The member for Griffith has been warned twice she can leave under 94A. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
On relevance. The Minister hasn't mentioned the energy supplement for pensioners at all.
The members on my right, the Minister will just wait. The Minister is, one, on the policy topic of the question, and two, my recollection is he mentioned it in the first sentence. The Minister has the call.
Still in your costings. The key to lower energy prices is to get more gas into the domestic market. And the Leader of the Opposition should pick up the phone to the Labor Leader in Victoria and pick up the phone to the Labor Leader in the Northern Territory who is sitting on 200 years' worth of gas and say, release that gas into the market, develop that gas, put Australian households and businesses first, and get behind the National Energy Guarantee as a means to a more reliable and affordable energy system.
The member for Gilmore.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment. Will the Minister update the House on the benefits of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and how it works as a foundation to create jobs for hard-working Australians in Gilmore and across the nation? Could the Minister explain what possible risks there are to jeopardise such job creation?
The Minister for Trade and Investment.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate getting the member for Gilmore to ask me the question about the TPP in particular, because she, like other members of this House, is also deeply committed to this government's agenda with respect to opening export markets, thereby driving economic growth and making sure that we drive jobs as a direct consequence. When we've seen, as a direct result of this government's export policies, opening up world's best preferential market access for Aussie exporters, that we are a government that has delivered in spades when it comes to jobs. 403,000 jobs delivered by this government by creating the right economic conditions, much of it driven by access to new export markets. So it's a critical part of what we as a government are focused on. And it's very different on Labor's side because so many of them are opposed to our free trade agreement agenda. They stand in the way of export deals. We saw only on Monday the member for Fremantle said in this House, one thing we know is that trade agreements entered into from our position as a developed high-wage economy don't do much to create jobs. And yet, in the member for Gilmore's own electorate, Jared Rubbs is creating jobs and said about the agreements that it really is both China and Korea, and I quote, an expansion which means new Australian jobs manufacturing high-quality products. But, you know, there's been a lot of commentary around the TPP, and in particular I had my attention drawn to a recent GQ article. The Leader of the Opposition was there, was looking very resplendent, I've got to say. He's there with his photograph.
The Minister knows the rules on props. Minister will remove the prop.
Mr Speaker, I've got to say, this guy is a lot more blue steel than he is blue collar, that's for sure. But the thing is, Mr Speaker, I've just got to show that I'm making reference to it just at one time.
The Minister will resume his seat. No, the Minister will resume his seat. Yep. Just before I call the member for Calwell, I'm not going to keep continually warning members on props only to be defied within 10 seconds. No, there's no right of appeal, I regret to say. The member for Calwell has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. How many widows will have their bereavement allowance cut while this Prime Minister is giving a $65 billion handout to big business?
The Minister for Social Services.
I'd like to thank the member for her question, and as she knows, through the welfare reform bill, we're simplifying 7 payments into one. And as we have made very clear, 99% of people will be no worse off under these changes. 99% of people will be no worse off under these changes. And I can also say to her that what we are doing is making sure for those who have to use our welfare system that they can navigate it, that it is not complex. And it is something that you did on your side as well, because we want to have a simplified welfare system which is easy for people to navigate. And as I've made very clear, 99% of people will be no worse off.
The member for Jagga on a point of order.
I fear he's finished without answering the question.
The member for Jagga, that was not a point of order, and I warn her. You can rise on a point of order, not to make a 10-second statement. And the member for Jagga well knows that. The member for Barker has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the Minister update the House on the importance of a strong and consistent approach to national security and protecting Australia's borders? Minister, are you aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Home Affairs has the call.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question. Mr Speaker, the reason that we have been able to secure our borders, the reason that we've been able to get the 8,000 children out of detention that Labor put into detention, the reason that we've been able to close 17 detention centres that Labor opened, and the reason, Mr Speaker, that we haven't had deaths at sea, whereas under Labor there were 1,200 deaths at sea, is because we have been able to put in place the policies, we have shown the strength of character, and we've had the resolve to maintain a position that has resulted in that humane outcome. Now, Mr Speaker, what the people smugglers look for is strength of character, and what they look for is consistency of position. We have had consistency of position in staring down people smugglers, as the Howard government did. It was clear to the people smugglers that Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard both failed the character test and failed the position that should have been adopted but that they walked away from. So, Mr Speaker, speaking of people who are walking away and failing the character test, the Leader of the Opposition walks away whenever this topic is raised because he doesn't like the inconvenience of the facts. The fact is, Mr Speaker, that this Leader of the Opposition fails the character test on a number of fronts. We know that this Leader of the Opposition, for example, Mr Speaker, stood up, so he said at the time, for workers, but as it turned out, the workers were dudded by this Leader of the Opposition when he was head of that union that was accepting payments from the employers, and it turned out the workers got ripped off. That's the reality, Mr Speaker. We see, in terms of the character test, again that this Leader of the Opposition fails, Mr Speaker. He stands up in this place criticising the Prime Minister for living at Point Piper, and yet we know that on a regular basis he's sipping Cristal at the homes of billionaires around the country. He's got his knees up on private jets flying from one side of the country to the other, and we know, Mr Speaker, that when he's in Queensland, this Leader of the Opposition is accepting hospitality.
The Minister will resume his seat. I'm not going to call the Manager of Opposition business. Even on the wording of the question, he's now straying completely off the topic of it. This is not. The Minister needs to direct himself to the question. If he wants to deal with those, I haven't finished. If the Minister wants to deal in that subject matter, he needs to be asked a question on it. He hasn't been asked a question on it.
Speaker. Mr Speaker, what the Australian public look for is strength of character. On every count, this man fails. On every count, and the people smugglers know it, Mr Speaker. The people smugglers know it because they see in him—
The Minister will just pause for a second. The member for Isaacs on a point of order.
That should be withdrawn for a start.
The member for Isaacs.
The point of order, thank you, Mr Speaker. It's under Standing Order 91C. This is persistently and wilfully refusing to conform to a standing order. The Minister knows that he should be sat down.
The member for Isaacs. No, the Minister will resume his seat. The member for Isaacs will not reflect on me in making such a point of order, and if he wants to discuss the relevance of that standing order and the practice, I'm happy to do it without wasting everyone else's time. The Minister has the call. He'll be relevant to the answer.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. What the Australian people want in their leader is somebody with strength of character that has the ability to stare down people smugglers. What we know of this man, Mr Speaker, is exactly what we knew of Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard. He says one thing to one audience, he walks out of the room and says the complete opposite to the next group of people. He cannot maintain a position because he does not have the strength of character. The fact is, Mr Speaker, that when it comes to border protection, you need to stare down the threat of people smugglers, and people smugglers recognise in this Leader of the Opposition an inherent weakness in his character, which is now known not only to those behind him but also to the Australian people.
The member for Isaacs. Oh, sorry, the member for Jagajaga.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Social Services. How many existing pensioners will lose the energy supplement under this government's plan to cut support to pensioners?
The Minister for Social Services. Members on both sides, the Minister has the call.
I'd like to thank the member for her question. And can I say, on this side, we have no policy which will see us reintroduce the carbon tax. We do not believe that we need an energy supplement which was brought in because of the carbon tax. Now, if you on those sides have secret plans, to reintroduce the carbon tax, then you should do so.
Has the Minister concluded his answer? The member for Bonner has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry, representing the Minister for Jobs and Innovation. Will the Minister outline to the House why it is important that the leaders of unions and employer organisations always act in the best interests of their members? Is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Defence Industry has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Bonner for his question. Mr Speaker, it's a very serious question because employees around Australia should be able to feel safe when they go to work, go about their business every day, expecting to be able to do so free of abuse, free of
the
abuse,
member for Kingston,
free of being intimidated.
The member for Kingston is warned.
All of us should be shocked, including the member for Kingston, who I'm surprised is standing up for this kind of behaviour.
The Minister
of the
will just pause
CFMEU.
for a second. I'm going to give the member for Kingston the benefit of the doubt because the member for McMahon is in my line of sight. I've warned the member for Kingston twice. If she interjects again, she'll be out. The member for McMahon needs to find a seat, otherwise he can keep walking. The Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We would all be shocked in this House at the treatment of the workers at the Oakey site who were going to work and being attacked by members of the CFMEU, being shouted at, verbally abused. Phrases like, Mr Speaker, and many of us have children, phrases like, "I'll effing rape your kids, you see," or "I'll rip out your spine," or "I'll rip out your spine," or "I'll hit you with a crowbar," Mr Speaker. What kind of people say things like that in this country? People at a CFMEU protest shouting at workers going about their everyday business, going to work to be able to feed their wives or their husbands and their children. This is the CFMEU, Mr Speaker, where 77 of its officials are currently in court, currently facing charges in court, with $13.5 million worth of fines, record fines, delivered against the CFMEU, and a union that's given $2.5 million in donations to the ALP just in the last 3 years. And yet, Mr Speaker, this Leader of the Opposition turns up to their rallies. He turns up to their rallies and says he'll rip up the IR laws that the Labor Party introduced and that we have added to, Mr Speaker. He welcomes them into the factional deals in the ALP fora in Victoria. He allows them to help pre-select candidates. He allows them to help set policy. This is the CFMEU that Bob Hawke says he would have thrown out of the Labor Party if he was the Labor leader. Yesterday, Mr Speaker, the member for Isaacs attempted a pathetic conflict of interest connection with the Prime Minister, Mr Speaker. The member for Isaacs should be ashamed as the Shadow Attorney-General, as should the Shadow Minister for Justice. Talk about conflict of interest, being in a party that's accepted $2.4 million worth of donations from the CFMEU, and yet the Shadow Attorney-General and the Shadow Minister for Justice are supposed to oversight that union if they should ever grace these benches again, Mr Speaker. It is disgraceful. If we're talking about conflicts of interest, the member for Isaacs and the Shadow Minister for Justice should be demanding the CFMEU get thrown out of the forums of the Labor Party, not doing grubby factional deals with them.
The member for Gorton.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. My questions to the Prime Minister. I refer to the amended Administrative Arrangements Order and note in the Department of Jobs section. The person responsible for administering the Fair Work Act is simply described as the Minister. Given there are two ministers in that department, can he confirm which minister is referred to in and responsible for administering the Fair Work Act?
The Prime Minister has
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. The minister responsible for administering the Fair Work Act is the Minister for Small and Family Business and Workplace Relations, the member for Reid.
The member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Attorney-General. Will the Attorney-General update the House on the importance of ending elder abuse across Australia? What action is the Coalition Government taking to end the terrible abuse of elder Australians, including in my home state of South Australia, and what are the alternatives?
The Attorney-General has the call.
Mr Speaker, I thank the member for her question, noting of course that the issue of elder abuse is of critical importance in her home state of South Australia with the release of the report into that government's handling of the Oakden Older Persons Mental Health Service. But before I return to that, I'll just note that the Turnbull government last week announced that it would lead a national plan on elder abuse, a first of its kind, and that builds on the 2016 election commitment of the Prime Minister, where $15 million was committed as a critical foundation to protecting the rights of older Australians. The National Plan was the capstone recommendation of the Law Reform Commission's 2017 report into elder abuse, and it's important for everyone to understand on the other side of the benches that there couldn't be any national plan, which we've committed to lead, without that 2016 commitment of money from the PM, because that develops the research base that allows us to proceed with a national plan. What Australia does not know, but will soon know, is the frequency and scale and context of elder abuse. Other studies overseas have indicated that elder abuse can affect up to 12% of the older population. In Australia, of course, we know that a quarter of all Australians will be over 65 by the middle of the century, but we are only just starting to understand how prevalent elder abuse is. Some studies have indicated, for instance, that in the financial context, with things such as duress, undue pressure, fraud, that about 40% of elder abuse occurs in that context. But, as was noted at the beginning of this answer, there are very timely reasons to know and understand that physical abuse of elders is occurring in Australia and that a national plan is warranted. And I simply wanted to put before the House 3 quotes from Bruce Lander QC's Oakden report in South Australia, which I think summarise the astonishingly terrible situation that has developed there. He said, first, the consumers who resided at the Oakden facility were some of the most frail and vulnerable persons in our community. They did not have a voice. They were obliged to live in a facility which could be only described as a disgrace. They were forgotten and ignored. He then went on to say of the South Australian Labor ministers, quote, each minister who had responsibility for the Oakden facility is responsible for its failures. He then said this, which I think is a remarkable quote in the report, quoting from Bruce Lander QC, quote, Mr Snelling, the Labor minister, said that during his 3 years as minister, there was no political will to change the model so as to avoid an argument with the unions. This is a 312-page report of some of the most horrendous treatment of older Australians, and a primary reason given why there was no reform was to avoid an argument with the unions. The report is entitled A Shameful Chapter in South Australia's History.
The member for Grayndler.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure and Transport, and I ask the Minister, why is federal infrastructure funding for South Australia just $95 million in 2020-21, or just 2% of the federal infrastructure and transport budget?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call. Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. Mr Speaker, we are spending considerable amounts of money in South Australia. Considerable amounts of money in South Australia, Mr Speaker. In fact, it's $3,439 million is the investment, Mr Speaker. $3,439 million, Mr Speaker. And whilst we're talking about spending and spending in infrastructure, Mr Speaker, Labor's average annual infrastructure spend was $6.05 billion. That's impressive. I'll give you that. That's impressive. Yep, that's good. But it's $2.1 billion less per year than the Coalition's $8.14 billion annual average spend as part of our record $75 billion spent in infrastructure. And Labor can cherry-pick the figures until, as my late father would say, until the cows come home, but the inescapable fact is that our record $75 billion infrastructure investment is delivering more than Labor ever did in South Australia or any other state.
The member for Grey.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Will the minister update the House on how the Coalition Government's record investment in hospitals around Australia is benefiting patients in my electorate of Grey? And is the minister aware of an alternative approach that is damaging the delivery of services for the hard-working people of Australia?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Grey, who's been a great champion for hospital and medical services in his electorate and right across South Australia in regional and rural towns. In particular, though, I know that, like many people, he was distressed when power was lost at the Port Augusta Hospital due to the incompetence of the South Australian government. And this joins the long list of South Australian hospitals that have the lights turned out. Royal Adelaide Hospital, the Flinders Medical Centre, Mount Gambier and so many others. Fortunately, we have been investing whilst they have been failing. At this level, across South Australia, we've invested a 26% increase in support for South Australian hospitals, a 26% increase, whilst the Weatherall government increased South Australian expenditure by 6% over that same period. And in the last full financial year, they decreased health expenditure by $7.5 million. That's the reality of what is happening under Labor. It compares with the investment that we have put in, and it compares with the growth which in the member's own electorate is even larger than the state average. Whereas our contribution has been an increase of 26% on average growth across South Australia, within the member for Grey's electorate, the local hospital district has seen a 31.5% increase in funding under us. So what we see there is a very clear statement of commitment to health, commitment to funding, reliability under us, and an utter failure not just of investment, but a complete failure to be able to keep the lights on in South Australian hospitals. This isn't trivial. This is fundamentally significant. It goes to a test of competence as a government, competence as economic managers, and competence as people running a medical system. And we have, on top of prisoners being shackled in hospitals for days, of people waiting for mental health beds for days, today we have the latest revelation about the faulty towers that is the Royal Adelaide Hospital.
Minister will resume his seat just for a second. The member for Franklin hasn't been called yet. The member for Franklin on a point of order.
Thank you. On relevance, the minister might like to talk about all the mental health patients waiting in Tasmania today.
The minister will resume his seat. That point of order, I have to say, is disorderly. The question did not talk specifically about one state. I appreciate the members from that state, but a repeat of that will see her ejected. She's warned.
Mr. Speaker, it was a desperate cry for relevance, because not only do we see another revelation in the Adelaide Advertiser about AMBOs being diverted to hospital as hospital EDs overflow, most notably in the Royal Adelaide Hospital. Today is the last day you would raise an issue about mental health and patients if you were the opposition, given what has occurred in South Australia. The Royal Commission, which the Attorney-General sets out, is a damning indictment of the South Australian government. The Premier should resign and the government should be turfed out. It is one of the great disgraces in Australian mental health care history.
Concluded. The member for Grayndler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is again addressed to the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister for Infrastructure and Transport, and I refer to the government's own budget papers for his own portfolio, which shows that federal infrastructure investment in Tasmania will fall from $174 million this financial year to $53 million in 2019-20. Is this a reflection of the fact that not a single new federally funded major infrastructure project has been commenced under either the Abbott-Joyce, the Turnbull-Joyce or the Turnbull-McCormick governments?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Thanks for the plug. I thank the thank the member for Grayndler for his question, Mr. Speaker. I tell you what, the people of Tasmania, there's one thing that they should do this Saturday, Mr. Speaker, and that's vote back the Will Hodgman Liberal government, Mr. Speaker. Now, he asked me about infrastructure spending in Tasmania. from 2013-14 to 2021, the Commonwealth has locked in $1.1 billion infrastructure investment in the Apple Isle. $1.1 billion. That should please the member for Lyons.
No, the member for Grain that will resume his seat. We've only just begun the answer. The member for Grain that will contain himself at least for a little while longer. The minister has.
Up and once said we've only just begun. And certainly when I say that we've only just begun, I could talk about the Midland Highway in Tasmania, Mr Speaker. $400 million over 10 years, 234 jobs. That's what this government's all about. Jobs, jobs, jobs in infrastructure. 403,000 created last year, 1,100 a day, many of them full-time employees, and many of them, thanks to the good policies of the Will Hodgman government, may they be re-elected this Saturday, $38 million towards the Hobart International Airport runway extension. The Coalition has already made a significant $150 million commitment to UTAS for the relocation and expansion of campuses in Launceston, $130 million, and Burnie, $20 million. I had dinner with Brett Whiteley last night, and he was talking about the hope, the optimism in Tasmania. I tell you what, we didn't see it when Labor were in power, either federally or statewide. That's why I say again, for Tasmanians watching this broadcast, vote 1 for the Will Hodgman government this Saturday. And as part of the Hobart City deal, Mr Speaker, as part of the Hobart City deal, the Commonwealth is working with UTAS on potential innovative financing solutions to support the university's presence in the city. Now that should please Tasmanians. It should please Tasmanians. I'm sure the member for Denison, who's absent, would be pleased. But, Mr Speaker, more than that, the freight rail revitalisation project, $59.8 million, Mr Speaker, in government funding. As I say, the Hobart Airport interchange, $24 million. Mr Speaker, we are making less congestion, better road safety, all the things that Tasmanians want, Mr Speaker. We're doing it federally, and the Will Hodgman government is doing it in the state. May he be re-elected with his government, his very good government, this Saturday.
Yeah. The member for Wright.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister explain why it's critical to adopt a consistent approach to public policy, and are there any alternative approaches?
Absolutely. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his question. And he's part of a government where every single policy is supporting jobs and growth, and we're delivering on jobs, 403,000 last year. Every lever of policy is pulling in the direction of more economic growth, more jobs and better jobs. And Australians know that, whether it is talking about the National Energy Guarantee, as the Minister for Energy spoke about it, or our business tax cuts, as the Treasurer has spoken about it, or our infrastructure investments, as the Deputy Prime Minister has talked about it, or defence industry, massive investments, as the Minister has spoken about it. Everything is pulling in the same direction, and we're seeing results. That's what you get with consistent policy. The honourable member asked me about alternatives, and I regret to say, Mr Speaker, we are seeing a shocking alternative at the moment, presented by the two-faced Leader of the Opposition. This is the man who only a few years ago said cutting the company income tax rate increases domestic productivity and domestic investment. More capital means higher productivity and economic growth, and leads to more jobs and higher wages. That's what he said then. He's thrown all that out. And of course, the member for McMahon, who still hankers after our economic common sense, has said, only a few weeks ago, when the budget has returned to surplus, then you can look to a further tax reform of both personal and company tax. But, Mr Speaker, the greatest inconsistency that we've seen, the worst alternative we've seen, is the most recent. So we go back to the middle of last year, when the Leader of the Opposition tells Senator Hanson that he's pro-coal. Bill Shorten said to her face, she says, that he, the Leader of the Opposition, was pro-coal, unlike others within Labor. And then on the 6th of October, standing shoulder to shoulder with a member for O'Connor, spewing at the injustice, he
He said, "We support you, we support you." And Tony Marr from the CFMEU said Bill Shorten is very pro-coal mining. And now we know, now he has a little deal, a little secret deal with Jeff Cousins, who also has a connection to the NBN, I'm sure. He's just round the corner from me in Point Piper. Jeff Cousins spent thousands of dollars taking the Leader of the Opposition up to the Great Barrier Reef, snorkelling, charter flights. Oh, it was a beautiful sight. And he gave an undertaking to Jeff Cousins, which was that he said that when Labor is in government, if the evidence is as compelling as we presently believe it to be, they will revoke the law.
The member for Gorton, member for McEwen will resume his seat. The member for Gorton has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to the Prime Minister's previous answer where he confirmed that the Minister for the Workplace is responsible for administering the Fair Work Act. I also refer to evidence at Senate estimates just now from Minister Cass that both her and the Minister for the Workplace are responsible for administering the Fair Work Act. Is this another example of the chaos of this government where ministers don't even know what they're in charge of? Or did the Prime Minister only make the decision to remove Senator Cass's responsibility today and not tell her?
Members on my right, the Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. On the subject of industrial relations and the Fair Work Act, you would think the member for O'Connor would be the member for Gorton. The member for Gorton. The member for Gorton, the member for O'Connor stands up for workers and jobs. He does. He's doing a great job. And I have to say, Mr Speaker, the member for Gorton from time to time benefits from the incidental association with the great member for O'Connor. And in the member for O'Connor's electorate, you've got plenty of miners, and they know they have got a member who defends them. Not like this member for Gorton here. He stood up with the Leader of the Opposition and Tony Marr and said to those workers that they were pro-coal. They were supporting them. But little did he know that his leader was taking thousands of dollars from a Point Piper millionaire, no less, going off on a trip to the Barrier Reef, snorkelling, flying around in charter jets. But it wasn't meant to come out.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
On direct relevance, Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister's strayed well and truly from who's responsible for administering the Fair Work Act.
Yes, the Prime Minister needs to, as I said in some earlier answers, confine himself to the subject of the question, which was the Fair Work Act.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. The Fair Work Act has been breached again and again by the CFMEU, breached again and again, millions of dollars of fines, and there was the member for Gorton and the Leader of the Opposition encouraging those workers, those members of the CFMEU, in their vile threats against workers that were going in there and doing their jobs. But, Mr Speaker, what they didn't know was that the Leader of the Opposition and the member for Gorton, no doubt, because he backs his Leader of the Opposition to the hilt, I'm sure, hilt or the butter knife, no doubt, Mr Speaker, what they didn't know was that the Leader of the Opposition was getting ready to cancel the Adani licence. And the legal grounds were all set out by Jeff Cousins, and, Mr Speaker, one of them related to new information about the offsets for the endangered black-throated finch. Now, Mr Speaker, do you think the workers at Oakey, how would they have responded if the Leader of the Opposition had said black-throated finches of the world unite? I don't think they would have been very impressed. He sold their jobs down the river to get green votes and, of course, a nice holiday on the Barrier Reef.
The member for Gorton.
Speaker, I seek to table the transcript of the Senate estimates, which actually goes to Senator Cass saying that she is responsible, along with the Minister for the Workplace, for the Fair Work Act.
Will resume his seat. The member for Gorton will resume his seat, and I'll rule on the point of order. I'm not trying to be difficult for the member for Gorton. I know the point he's trying to make, but I've ruled consistent with rulings of previous speakers that we're not going to have a rotisserie of tabling Hansard, which is already a document of the parliament. The member for Tangney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Social Services. Will the minister update the House on action the coalition government is taking to keep welfare payments out of the hands of drug dealers? Is the minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Social Services.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Tangi for his question. And I know that anyone who's listened to his maiden speech or other contributions in this parliament knows that he has a very personal interest in the welfare space. As all members know, this government is creating 1,100 jobs a day, and we want to make sure that everyone in society who can work is taking advantage of this unprecedented economic growth. And we also want to make sure that welfare payments aren't subsidising drug dealers. Today, the government reintroduced legislation where we will seek to implement a trial to help people get off welfare who are suffering from substance abuse problems, get treatment, get rehabilitation and to get a job. We're doing this because research has shown that one of the worst barriers to getting a job is substance abuse. And as the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare's 2016 National Drug Strategy Health Survey has shown, illicit drug use was more prevalent amongst the unemployed than it is the employed. Those who are unemployed are 3 times as likely to use methamphetamines. Importantly, the drug testing trial is complemented by the government's other substance abuse measures. And this includes a measure where, for the first time, job seekers are able to undertake drug or alcohol treatment as an approved activity in their job plan. Since the commencement of this measure on 1 January, 259 job seekers have had drug or alcohol treatment included in their job plan. We want to make sure that we're helping people to help themselves. We want to make sure that we're putting the policies in place that mean that people have a real opportunity, a real chance to benefit from the jobs growth that we are seeing in this country. Now, all our measures when it comes to the economy are about jobs growth, are about economic growth. And when it comes to those of a working age, we want to make sure that all our measures are helping all those people, especially those less fortunate who are suffering from substance abuse, whether it be drug abuse or alcohol abuse, can benefit from this unprecedented jobs growth. And I say to those opposite, I would like to work with you to get this trial up and running. We've got $1 million for an evaluation, $1 million for an evaluation, so we can get it right, because we want to help everyone benefit from the 1,100 jobs we are creating a day.
The member for Newcastle will cease interjecting. The member for Newcastle, and whoever it is on my right, member for Newcastle will cease interjecting. The member for Braddon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Tasmanian Deputy Premier Jeremy Rockliff has said the fruit fly outbreak in Tasmania is, and I quote, a national system breakdown. Is this fruit fly outbreak the fault of the Tasmanian government, the federal government, or both?
The Minister for Agriculture.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'm somewhat surprised that the honourable member would ask such a question in such a tone, because this is not an exotic outbreak or incursion. It's in fact come from Victoria, so the question may be better directed to Daniel Andrews and the Labor government in Victoria. How do you not understand biosecurity in this nation? You have failed the people of Tasmania. You don't understand the biosecurity measures that are taking place in this nation. And in fact, we as a government have put $200 million extra, $200 million extra under the Competitive Ag White Paper that the member for New England instigated. We as a federal government put $9 million only this year into fruit fly measures to ensure that there is better detection of fruit fly. And the Hodgman government has put $2 million in as soon as there was an incursion. That's what a real government does. They act, they prepare, and when there is an incursion, they make sure that there is results.
The member for Barara.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer inform the House on how the government is acting to ensure the safety of Australian motorists through its compulsory recall of defective Takata airbags? How many vehicles are covered by this compulsory recall, and how will it work?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Barara for his question on this very serious matter. Today, the Assistant Minister to the Treasurer announced a compulsory recall of Takata airbags based on a recommendation of the ACCC following an extensive safety investigation in August of 2017 and consultation with affected manufacturers, industry stakeholders and international experts. This is one of the largest recalls in the nation's history, with a total of 4 million cars affected by defective airbags and around 2 in every 7 vehicles on Australian roads. The compulsory recall will capture around 2.3 million vehicles that still have a defective airbag that needs replacement, including 1 million vehicles that have not yet received a replacement under the existing voluntary recalls. This notice requires all vehicle suppliers to recall and replace defective Takata airbags in their vehicles by December 31, 2020. Now, importantly for customers, vehicle manufacturers will be required to cover the full cost of replacing these airbags. Mr Speaker, the safety of all of Australians is the #1 priority of this government, not just on issues of national security but on issues of consumer security as well, Mr Speaker, and all matters of public security. Absolute priority will be given to replacing the Alpha airbags, which pose an immediate and critical safety risk. Priority will also be given to airbags assessed as high-risk base. If a vehicle is recalled, an owner can contact their local dealer or manufacturer to book in a time to have their airbag replaced. Now, we advise and implore all Australians not to ignore or delay responding to letters from the vehicle manufacturer asking to have airbags replaced, and to contact the ACCC if they experience any difficulties or delays in obtaining a replacement airbag, and I commend the Assistant Minister for Treasurer for his initiative in this regard.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you. Thank you.
No, Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.